In this section, we'll be looking at adding nozzles to our pressure vessel design here in Compress. Now this process is going to be the same whether you're working with a heat exchanger or a pressure vessel, so just keep that in mind. The first thing that we're going to want to do here is go to the right hand side of our screen where we can select our detailed nozzle design. You can also use the shortcut F2 on your keyboard. Once I have selected the nozzle, I can hover over the position that I'd like to place that nozzle on the vessel. You do have the ability to change the size of the nozzle as well as the type using the dialog up here. With the scroll wheel, you can also change the size of the nozzle as well. Now for this example, I'll just place my first nozzle here. And then if I want to make any changes, all I have to do is double click the nozzle, which brings us to our component menu where we can make changes to the style, how it's attached to the parent component, and depending on the style that you choose, we'll also have some additional options here on the right as well. If you are working with a standard type of component, such as our standard pipe here, if you select your standard size lookup, you'll be able to select from a set of standard pipe sizes and schedule for your thickness, and that will automatically update the outer diameter and thickness here in the dialog for you. Now, in case you missed it, you do have your materials here where you can select the type of material that the nozzle is made out of, as well as any material options here. Now down at the bottom, we'll be setting the location and orientation of this nozzle. Starting with the orientation, you can select either radial, tilted, or offset from the center line. Now if I select my radial nozzle here, if I want to set the location, I have a couple different options. I can either reference one of the circumferential seams on this component, or I can reference my datum. If I decide to reference the datum, we will just enter in the offset here from our datum, the angular position, and the projection from the center. If I choose to use a circumferential seam for the reference, I'll also need to select which component that the nozzle will be placed on. Now when it comes to setting this external projection, if you prefer to reference the outside surface instead of the center of the vessel, you can select this option here, where you can then enter in your projection from the outside surface of the shell. On the next page, we'll be looking at the area of replacement calculations. Now for more details, you can see down here in the lower right where we have the area required by code versus the area available with this current design. We'll also be able to see the minimum weld sizes out here to the right of some of our weld size inputs. Now as we make changes to either our internal projection or if we add a reinforcing pad, the area available is going to update. So this makes it very easy for us to iterate through different pad thicknesses, internal projection, so we can start playing with different thicknesses and see how that affects our design. All right. Another thing to keep in mind is up here at the top, you will also be able to see your limits of reinforcement. If we check this box here, you'll be able to visually see what your limits of reinforcement are. That way, if you do add a reinforcing pad that becomes larger, then those limits, we're no longer going to be adding that to the area available. Additionally, for your welds, you do have the ability to select full penetration welds, which you can also change the bevel direction as well. Now down at the bottom, we have the ability to add some nozzle loads that will allow us to look at the local stress in the shell using the WRC 537. You can also switch this to 107 as well if you prefer. And this is basically where we will enter in our radial loads, bending moments, and shear forces. I do have a more detailed video on this as well if you'd like to look at that. But I'll simply just add in a standard nozzle loading from API 660. If you do have more data from your customer, you can load that into the software to reference later. Alright, next we can add in a nozzle connection. So by selecting the nozzle connection option, it will give us the ability to add either a standard ASME flange, elbow, pipe, or reducer. We can also select custom Appendix 2 as well as Appendix Y flanges. For this example, I'll select a standard ASME flange, and then here I can select the flange size as well as the flange type and the flange class. Now, since we're in rating mode, if I try to select a flange that's below the minimum required flange class, the software is automatically going to round me up to that required flange size. I can increase if I'd like though. If you do have a blind included with this flange, you can use this checkbox down here below. Now, if you have a nozzle that's going to be located on that blind, you will need to change to a UG34 cover. Next, we'll select our circumferential seam radiography. Then we can select the material for both the flange and our bolts. And then finally, if we need to derate the flange based on flange loadings, we can do that by selecting this first option here. If we have any nozzle loads applied in our WRC menu, those will get transferred over to the flange, or we can add our own user-defined loads here. Alright, so now if we're happy with everything here and we're meeting our area required, we can click OK. In a case where we were not meeting this area required, if we do try to move on, we'll get the option to change our current design. So if you want to make a change, you can click yes. However, if you want to ignore this error, you can click no, and that will allow you to continue on. Now let's add an additional nozzle down at the bottom on one of our heads. We'll add it to the bottom here. Now we could come in, and if we wanted to select the nozzle here, we could use Control C and Control V to paste that nozzle down below. But I'll place this nozzle here, and then we'll add a new nozzle down here at the bottom. Maybe we'll make this a 4-inch nozzle. And we'll also add a piping component. So up here at the top, you'll be able to add a couple different piping components. I believe the limit is going to be 5 piping components, and only 1 can be an elbow. But if I add an elbow here, I can add that to my nozzle. I can use the scroll wheel to change the orientation. And then I can also add in a nozzle pipe if I'd like. Again, if I want to make any changes to the nozzle, all I have to do is zoom in and select the nozzle, or I can also use the component tree here to navigate to those different components. Alright, the last thing that I want to talk about when we're looking at our nozzles is if we do have a case where we have a nozzle that's going to be passing through one of our long seams, we do have the option, if we select our nozzle here, to select this as a category A joint. However, if you would like to move the long seam in the model, you can select the long seam tool here, where you can either manually select the starting angle of each of the long seams, or you can use this option here for the software to automatically try to avoid the nozzles that are on the shell. So that'll be all we have for adding nozzles to our pressure vessel example here. Next, we'll take a look at adding a support. In this case, we'll be using a support skirt as our example.